Hello, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. And now you can see my moneymaker here, the handsome face. I say that kiddingly, of course. I think most of you would be happy if we just kept the screen covered all day long. But nonetheless, we are happy to have you here for what is going to be a fun show for us. Have not talked to Mike Griffith in a couple of weeks. Obviously, I had to be away from work last week, but happy to be back doing that again today. A couple of recruiting notes we'll give you before the show is done. I'll let you decide what you think all of this means, but we'll do that. Arian Smith said some interesting things today. We're going to touch on a moment or two about that and kind of reflect on the hot topic from yesterday, the Kendall Milton injury. We'll do some of that via Arian Smith here coming up a little bit later on. But off the top, last year, Georgia seemed to use the motivation of doubters as fuel to win the national championship. This year in 2023, that is going to be a whole lot harder to do. How is Georgia responding to that then in terms of the mindset that it's cultivating? And even in the midst of back-to-back national championships, are there still maybe some naysayers out there? We're going to explore that topic here off the top of the show. Glad to have you with us as we do it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Breda Pest Management, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Breda Pest Management, the official pest control of UGA Athletics.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
One of the real truisms in life is that haters are going to hate. We know that. That's what makes them haters. And in 2022, I would say that we saw some evidence of some haters out there for Georgia, even though Georgia had won the national championship and spent most of the year dominating every team that had played on the way to a second national championship. There was, and we pointed this out at the time because it kind of irritated us, there was this sort of weird level of doubt that existed around Georgia. Some of this was prior to the season when the entire world was in love with Ohio State and Alabama, who, by the way, is nowhere to be found in the postseason conversation. Some of this was part of the Tennessee game when everybody just seemed really amped up about the idea of kind of a newcomer into the national championship playoff discussion and this notion that Georgia, who was in the eyes of some, maybe some sort of fluke or flash in the pan, they were going to cede their spot at the top of the SEC pecking order for this upstart Tennessee team that some people I just think liked better because of the fact that they were playing a more finesse brand of football. But whatever the reasoning was, there were doubters for UGA a year ago. I think there's a tendency on the part of the media sometimes to misremember things like this because everybody responds to incentives, and the media is incentivized to kind of recast stories after they happen to make them seem, in retrospect, more obvious than they appeared at the time, because by doing so, that makes them feel smarter because all of this stuff feels like something they could have easily predicted. And yet, if you want to go back in many moments during last season, you see example of people maybe not quite realizing what an obvious conclusion we were heading to, Georgia winning its second straight national championship. And the fact that Georgia players, and in some cases coaches, were honest about that and open about that and frankly called some of that out, I thought was a really good thing. Good example of that in January as it relates to Georgia quarterback Stetson Bennett, who, by the way, probably faced more of these so-called doubters than anybody did. But he was also quick to point out the team itself also had plenty of that there as well. Let me let you hear this as a way of setting us up for what our topic's going to be today. This is Stetson Bennett from January.
This is what we set out to do this year. There's a lot of people who doubted us. A lot of people who, and I know people are gonna be like, "Well, no, we didn't." Well, yeah, you did. Maybe not doubted us as far as unranked doubted us, but there wasn't a consensus, and it seems as if people have forgotten that storyline, and forgotten what this team has done as a collective. Fought through that and heard all the doubters whenever we're talking about 15. Draft picks lost to the draft, and a lot of those guys over there on defense and even on offense heard that, and so we went to work and we took it week by week, and now we're here. So I think that's really special.
So I think what Stetson Bennett says there is 100% true. Every single word of that's 100% true. That no one was predicting Georgia to be unranked, and some of the stuff we heard in the national championship game about Georgia going 6-6 or 7-5, I don't know that anybody actually said that, but you did have, Taquito Spikes in the SEC network predicting that Georgia would lose to South Carolina prior to the season started. You had Chris Doering on the SEC network predicting that Georgia would lose to Kentucky. You had the entire world predicting that Georgia would lose to Tennessee. You had some people who even suggest that Georgia could lose to Oregon. That if you actually want to go back and look, there were at least some voices suggesting that Georgia could lose any number of the games that it played last season, even though it ultimately didn't lose any of them. So what Bennett says there, I believe, is 100% correct. And I do believe that Georgia was right to have a chip on its shoulder last season, and the idea that a guy like Bennett doesn't necessarily want to let the commentariat, if you will, off the hook on that. I think that's probably all fair, and I think that's probably all good as it relates to the Georgia storyline for last season. But here's where the tone kind of changes a little bit. That what worked last year doesn't necessarily work this year. And if it was true last year that Georgia was doubted, there were at least two teams thought to be more likely national champions when the season began than Georgia was a year ago, that if you could create reasonable levels of doubt about Georgia last season, it is going to be far harder to do that this year. Doubters are going to be a whole lot more difficult to find, and some of the early gambling information that we have about the upcoming season, I think, gives us an idea of just how true that is. Let me show you this from FanDuel. This is one of those online sports books that has posted some early national championship odds. We'll see more of this, and eventually some of this will kind of change a little bit. But what you see is that Georgia is by far and away the favorite to win this year's national championship. They are right now what's you're listed as plus 220, which essentially means they are just slightly above a 2-1 chance of winning the national championship, where the next closest team, Alabama, is just 5-1. That's a little bit of a gap between the highest rated favorite and the next rated favorite than you sometimes see. Then you get to Ohio State, that's at 7-1. Only three teams with odds shorter than 10-1 to win the national championship. Georgia in a far better position than both Alabama and Ohio State. Then you get to Michigan, who's currently 10-1, USC, who's currently 16-1, Florida State 18-1, LSU same odds. By the way, those two teams will play to begin the season. Then you get to the two teams at 20-1, Clemson and Penn State, and that's it in terms of the relatively short odds to win the national championship. And Georgia far above all those other teams. So the idea of if it was true that you were doubted to begin the 2022 season, and if it was true that you faced some doubt during the season, going to be a lot harder to establish that as a narrative here this year because, gambling odds reflective of the opinion at large of college football fans and media types, whatever else, they just sort of view Georgia as a prohibitive favorite to win this year's national championship. So how do you cultivate that motivation then, knowing that you won't be playing week to week trying to vanquish critics or shut this guy up or shut that person up or whatever else? You don't quite have that in store for you this year. So what do you do in place of all of that? Well, we heard a little bit from Kirby Smart the other day at the Macon Touchdown Club. He was talking about, the fact they don't expect to be a one-hit wonder. They don't expect to go away anytime soon. And they're trying to kind of conjure up other great sports franchises, other great sports entities for kind of how they've maintained a level of success, how they come back and do it year after year after year. And one of the things that Smart talked about in that particular Q&A session down in Macon was the idea of teaching the team to be okay with eating off the floor. Now, what does that mean necessarily? No 5-second rule, I don't guess, here on this. This means, something, far beyond all of that, of the idea of, I sort of interpret this as, hey, don't assume you're too good to eat off the floor, and don't be so satiated that you're not hungry enough to get down and eat off the floor. That's how much you want your next meal and all that. Basically, kind of keeping that same edge and intensity now that you've had success as you had while you're chasing success. That's kind of my way of interpreting all that. But frankly, some of the Georgia players who are hearing this message on a more regular basis than I am, I think they probably actually have a little bit better interpretation on that. So in light of the fact that Georgia is now the clear favorite and the so-called doubters that may have existed before, they're going to be a lot harder to come by here right now, then how does this Georgia team eat off the floor, as Kirby Smart says, and stay hungry despite the fact there has been so much success? I actually thought Kamari Laster had, the Georgia cornerback, I thought Kamari Laster had something really good to say about that last week. This is what Laster did say.
Eating off the floor is just a mentality, like you're not too big for anything. You're not too big to do the little things right. You're not too big to do the things that got you to where you are. So, just going in and approaching every day, like I said, like it's your last day, giving your best at every opportunity you have.
What's the motivation, and I know that Coach Smart is a master motivator, and last year he had a lot of you guys sold on, apparently nobody thought you were going to be good or something he said, which couldn't be further from the truth, by the way. But now everybody thinks you're going to be good. You're going to be a preseason number one to make history as a three-peat. So where do you feel like the team has drawn some inspiration, or is there still a chip on the shoulder? Or, what do you think collectively the team is motivated by this offseason?
I think we're motivated by just, not getting complacent, not not trying to stay stagnant. If we stay stagnant, then people will catch up to us, and then if people catch up to you, you're eventually gonna get beat. And just to not wanting to lose. We at Georgia, we want to win every game. We want to win against everybody we play. So just the will to win is what's keeping us going. Is what's motivating us.
So I think that's all really strong stuff from Kamari Lassiter. Everything that he says sounds exactly like you would hope it would sound for a team that's trying to conjure up the right mindset going after a historic season of go for three and 23. Everything that Lassiter says there is completely right. But any of you who've ever accomplished anything great in your life, you'll know this, is that what Lassiter says there is easier said than done. That, hey, we're going to fight against complacency each and every day. We're going to do that. But at some point in time, maintaining that consistent edge, that consistent focus is just difficult to do. In fact, we probably saw this from Georgia a year ago, where I don't know that the best version of Georgia played every single Saturday last season. In fact, I'm pretty sure that it didn't. Now, when Georgia really needed to be at its best, it was certainly more than capable of getting the job done. But there were a few days in which good enough would have gotten you by, and Georgia kind of was just sort of good enough. So on the one hand, the schedule for the upcoming season provides more opportunities for that, but you are always a little bit concerned of, hey, if you get too used to being less than your best too frequently, then can you really conjure up and be that version of yourself when you really need to? Georgia proved in 2022 it could, but those questions will be asked once again in 2023 there as well. But this is where I think the overall talent level of the program probably helps it. Because the kind of edge that Georgia might not need to win all of its games this season because it's going to be such a big favorite, if you're a player, you do need that same edge, though, to approach practice on a day-in, day-out basis, where you've got to not just prove yourself against the 12 regular season opponents that you'll play, but you must also prove yourself against the guys you're going up against in practice because, let's face it, attention and playing time and fame and in some cases financial reward, that can be a finite resource. And the fight to get all of that takes place away from our eyes, not on TV, not inside a stadium which we're attending, but on a practice field. And that may be how these Georgia players keep from letting that complacency kind of creep in, because you might be complacent and go out there and beat South Carolina or Kentucky or whoever else, but you can't be complacent and go out there and hold your starting job, hold your playing time and your position with so many other young guys and guys who are hungry and who are willing to eat off the floor, who are maybe trying to take that from you. So that could be part of the mindset for UGA here for this upcoming season. But there's also this, and then we'll move on and talk about something else, that just because it's going to be hard to find doubters for this upcoming season, and just because the gambling odds reflect Georgia as a very large prohibitive favorite in this year of 2023, that doesn't mean that everyone's always going to give Georgia proper credit, and that doesn't mean there won't sometimes be people who are still kind of reluctant to bend the knee and admit that Georgia is just at the top of the college football world. In fact, some kind of familiar voices seem to keep showing up on some of this kind of stuff. I saw our buddy, Connor Riley, had this on Twitter yesterday from Heather Dinich on ESPN. Now, we have a rule around here as it relates to Dinich, is that at one point in time, I think that when she would say something kind of crazy about Georgia, we'd sort of put it on the show, make a little bit of a big deal about it. But at a certain point in time, she's just sort of done that kind of thing so frequently that it becomes a little too easy. We don't really use her as fodder for topics as much anymore. She's kind of in the category of what maybe a Dan Wolke from USA Today became, or what a Danny Cannell, even though I kind of like Danny a little bit, what Danny Cannell kind of came, where it's like sort of a famed, hater to the point where it was a little too cheap and easy to use that to put points on the board during the show. But nonetheless, we'll show this and I'll read this to you. Heather Dinich, on the subject of Tennessee trying to make the playoff here this year, she wrote at ESPN yesterday that last fall, Tennessee beat Alabama, earned a number one ranking for a fleeting moment. Then, listen to this, lost a close game to eventual national champion Georgia, and the Vols came within a whisper of making the college football playoff for the first time. Connor's tweet, and I think he said this very well, is this is fan fiction. No one who actually watched the Georgia-Tennessee game last year would call that a close game. So it is an example, I think, of Heather Dinich kind of doing what she's done before as it relates to Georgia, so much so that she's not really a serious voice that we pay a ton of attention to on a show like this, but it is certainly an example of the truth that just because Georgia does have very many doubters doesn't mean they'll be without doubters this season. In fact, not only will people get it wrong in the present about Georgia, it seems like some people are even still getting it wrong when it comes to the past. That Georgia dominated Tennessee, could have beaten that on that particular Saturday in November as bad as it wanted to, but it was rainy and Georgia just decided to end the game and go home. And any kind of moral victory that Tennessee would want to claim for that, or someone would want to claim on behalf of Tennessee on that, is simply in error. And this same Vols team also went out to give up, 63 points, whatever, to South Carolina. They did not come within a whisper of making the college football playoff, and they did not keep it close with Georgia last season. Frankly, nobody, for the most part, other than Ohio State, kept it close with Georgia at all. So to kind of finish all this up, yes, Georgia is the prohibitive national championship favorite, and that's going to make finding doubters hard. But it won't be impossible. And for a team that might need to be in search of every form of motivation it can get over the course of the upcoming year, you may occasionally get somebody not giving you full credit as something to use. As Stetson Bennett told us off the top of the show, that's something that Georgia used a year ago, and if there's any opportunity to use it again here in 2023, you better believe Georgia will do it again. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Breda Pest Management, and we're happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us live on video today. We start at 9:45, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, DawgNation app. We're 10 a.m. after that, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, on the radio at noon, on App and Sports Radio 960 Ref, and available as a podcast, wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. So happy to have you here with us, and so thankful for our friends at Breda Pest Management to make it all possible. You know, they're the official pest control provider of UGA Athletics. I think that's a really good thing because obviously you don't get recognized as that. You don't get a chance to partner with an organization like UGA Athletics unless you're doing great work and have a reputation for doing great work for a really long time. That means bugs, critters, termites, all those things protected at Sanford Stadium, protected on all the athletic venues there at UGA across the campus. That same level of protection could be belonging to you there too. But here's the good news. For a program as well resourced as, or I should say an organization as well resourced as Breda Pest Management is, they also want to use that strength to help you here there as well. They've been in business since 1975. They've got 125 employees. I've driven by and I've seen their corporate campus. It's gorgeous, beautiful, big and impressive, and all of those impressive characteristics that Breda Pest Management brings to the table, they want to leverage those to your benefit by allowing you to save money instantly when you make the switch to Breda Pest Management for your termite protection, your pest control, and everything else. Let's face it, whatever fly-by-night company you might be working with, that cost of service for you may be going up year after year after year. Well, at Breda Pest Management, that stops. Put money in your pocket just for making the switch. Trust the pest control provider that UGA trusts to take care of its athletic venues. You can do that for your own home there as well. So find them online, BredaPest.com. That is BREDA, BredaPest.com for a lot more on that. All right, we're going to get Mike Griffith coming up in just a moment. Looking forward to talking to him here today. Prior to us doing that, though, I want to go around the DawgHouse. And I kind of want to revisit a topic a little bit that we discussed yesterday as it relates to the Kendall Milton injury. Now, we had our say on that. Pretty much every Georgia fan does. And here's the thing that we all understand. Any kind of story like this in the springtime is going to be exaggerated in terms of the conversation that takes place around it because Georgia football fans are obsessive. I'm an obsessive. You're an obsessive. We sort of obsess over this topic. And in the springtime, we have less stuff to fixate on because there's not a game to play on Saturday. There are just these practices. And so every little thing probably becomes a bigger thing. Now, Kendall Milton being injured and missing the rest of the spring is probably a little bit more than just a little thing. But I think it's also been probably blown up more than it needs to in terms of the reaction we're getting to this. In other words, I said this in the show yesterday, and I think it's worth restating here right now. My bet on Kendall Milton, admittedly this would be a small bet, my bet on Kendall Milton is that Milton will likely still be Georgia's leading rusher this upcoming season. And if I had to bet, I'd say chances are better than not that his rushing yard total this year exceeds Georgia's rushing yard total for its season-long leader a year ago, Kenny McIntosh. I could see Milton getting up near 900 yards, something like that, which is more than what McIntosh had last season. So I don't know that my season-long outlook has changed on Milton. Frankly, I don't think that Georgia should be rushing to the transfer portal over this or getting too concerned about anything else. Milton's one of those guys that has dealt with his share of injuries, but he's also a guy that I think can still have a very bright future at UGA. We asked Jake Fromm about this directly yesterday. Jake joins us every Tuesday. I think it's always worth your time to hear what Jake has to say. We asked Jake directly, hey, do you think that there's something that kind of connects all these injury stories together for Milton, or do you think this is just an aspect of just sort of being bad luck? And Jake didn't hesitate to say, in the case of the Milton injury, despite the fact that he's dealt with a few of these things since he's been here at Georgia, that Jake has every reason to believe that it's probably just bad luck, and this doesn't change the season-long outlook for Milton this upcoming season. Another guy who talked about this a little bit yesterday too was Georgia wide receiver Arian Smith, who has also dealt with his own series of nagging injuries that has also taken him off the field a little bit more than maybe he would have liked to over the course of his time at UGA. And he was kind of asked about that, and he actually pivoted the conversation, talk a little bit more about what his message to Kendall Milton has been through all of this, as Milton has the hamstring injury, and they'll keep him off the field for the rest of spring practice, we're told. This is Arian Smith, the wide receiver, yesterday.
I really focus on the time, like present. Like I really try to think about like the future or the past. Like it happened, it happened. Unfortunately, I had 3, so I done dealt with it a lot. I told K-Mill early days, just, it happens, man. I was like, my roommate, Dejan, he was dealing with something too, so I was like, just keep your head, straight. Just focus on the present, what you can do to get better, to get healthy.
That's good, wise words. And when Kirby Smart talks about, hey, we want a good connection on our team, we want our team to feel connected to each other, that's connection right there. Hey, I went and gave some words of encouragement to Kendall Milton. He's a different position group to me. I've got my own injury stuff to worry about. I've got my own health and recovery to kind of pay attention to. But I'm gonna go over here. I'm gonna give Kendall a pat on the back and make him feel better about his situation. When Kirby Smart talks about being connected as a team, that's what he's talking about. And I take that pretty seriously in the case of Arian Smith. That hey, you're gonna shake this off. I'm shaking my thing off, and we're gonna go out there. We're gonna both be big time contributors for this team here this season. In fact, I don't have time to play this audio for you. But something else that Arian said yesterday that I thought was really kind of cool, talking about kind of a new look on offense with all the kind of new coordinator things like that. The word that he used was, hey, this is an opportunity for, different players to kind of get a chance to show what they're all about. And to me, the word opportunity stands out there. I think that's an interesting choice of words for Arian Smith to use because I believe it draws kind of a sharp contrast between spring practice and fall practice. Fall practice, when you start late July, you're talking about 5-6 weeks away from playing your first game. Fall practice, I believe, is defined by obligation. In fall practice, you got an obligation. You got to get out there and coach got to find out who they trust to play. Players have to show how well developed they are. This is the time to find out what you're all about because you're about to start playing games for real. Even if it's a soft September schedule like Georgia is, there is still an obligation in fall camp to get it fixed, to get it set, and get ready to go out there and play. I would say that springtime, by comparison, even the SEC, where it's still a lot more rough and tumble and these spring games are televised to a certain extent and we give a lot of attention to spring practice, I believe, is still a little bit different than fall practice. If fall practice, that camp that takes place prior to the season, if that's about your obligation, then spring practice is a little bit more about the word that Arian Smith used yesterday. It's a little bit more about your opportunity. It's an opportunity to kind of figure out, hey, what would it look like if we put this guy in at running back? What would it look like if we put this guy in at wide receiver? Opportunity to say, hey, it's a new quarterback, new offensive coordinator, new this, new that. I'm going to get a chance to also kind of reboot my image in this program for a player that maybe hasn't been playing as much as he'd like to. I'm going to see if I can impress somebody this spring. It's more about the opportunity. And the stakes, I would say, are much lower. Let's keep in mind here that very good Georgia players, Nakobe Dean, Brock Bowers, Roquan Smith, I would say Marvin Jones Jr. this year. There are some very good players in the Georgia program who have missed their spring practice and gone on to have historic seasons on the follow-up to all of that. And I would say that Kendall Milton, while, he himself, we played this audio for you yesterday, he himself has said, hey, one of my big goals this year is to stay healthy. And for a guy that's had a handful of nagging injuries that's caused him to miss games in all 3 of his seasons at UGA, you can understand why he has that as a goal. But in terms of making some sort of fatalistic proclamation about Georgia at the running back spot because of the fact that Milton has gotten injured during spring, for now, all this creates is an opportunity for somebody else. Come fall, Milton will be obligated to show what he's all about as Georgia gets ready to play the games that matter most. But for now, that's still a few months away. So the Milton story is probably the biggest thing to happen to Georgia thus far this spring. But in light of everything that's going to happen in the many months to come here in 2023, I don't think it'll rank as very big by then the way that it feels now. And keeping that in mind is probably an appropriate thing to do. And Arian Smith's words from yesterday give us a chance to do just that. That is Around the DawgHouse here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management today. Now, before we are done, there are a couple of recruiting notes I want to give you involving guys that either have Georgia offers who have been outright Georgia targets who are getting ready to make their recruiting decisions. We'll let you decide for yourself what all of this means. I think in some cases here, the writing may be on the wall. So we're going to talk about that. But for now, getting ready to also chat with Mike Griffith on the subject of what is going on at spring practice, the outlook there at the running back spot, national championship odds, who does stand as a contender in comparison to Georgia. Anybody out there that's an actual threat? We'll talk about all of that and more with Mike Griffith here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
We'll settle to Mike Griffith here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management today. Mike, good to be back with you again after we were away last Wednesday. And I want to bring you in on the conversation we were just having as it relates to the Kendall Milton injury. This is probably the biggest story, I think, to come out of spring practice here thus far. And as it counts, not great news, but also not a fatalistic type story for me either. I think my bet would be that Milton is probably still Georgia's leading rusher this season. I think he has a chance to even have more rushing yards than Georgia's leading rusher had a year ago. Clearly it's a series of injuries for Kendall Milton. But, as Jake Fromm told us yesterday, look, bad luck's a part of football, and sometimes guys have to deal with a little bit of bad luck. It's certainly not my position that the Kendall Milton thing is nothing, a non-story. It's a story. But I do think in some respects some Georgia fans have taken a little bit too fatal of a view on all of this. So let's hear from you on the topic of what the Milton injury means for Georgia, the running back spot in particular.
Well, in conjunction with Dajon Edwards' injury is where it gives you a problem, is that you've got both of those guys that have been limited or out. And, we reported on that last week, that Dajon Edwards also has been sidelined and limited. So your number one and number two back are out, Brandon. And I think, and I could be wrong here, I don't think this is too much of a conspiracy theory, but I think that's why Georgia didn't have a scrimmage on Saturday. Because they're down to two healthy scholarship backs, and I don't know how much of the offense Roderick Robinson knows at this point. I know you give him the ball and he runs over people. I know that. And I know that Branson Robinson is quite the load, too. But those are your only two healthy scholarship backs, and beyond that, I believe there's a walk-on available or two. But to me, here's where it's an issue, because I've heard people say, well, it's only spring, it doesn't matter. Well, not exactly. It matters because right now is when Mike Bobo is trying to install and design a new offense. And you want to find out what these guys can do, and you want to see how it looks. And, this is kind of the test flight for your offense. And, I think it's an over-exaggeration to say that the running backs are the wings, but they're at least flaps on the wings of this airplane, this spaceship Georgia. So missing your number one and number two running back for half a spring drills, I think that does put a little dent in some of your spring preparations. Again, you can recover from it. You've got a very easy schedule next September. There's a long runway, but it's not convenient. And in conjunction with Dajon Edwards, I would agree that the Kendall Milton, hamstring, albeit not as overly serious injury, he'll be back training this summer, but it does put a crimp in the plans this spring.
So, for those of us who may not be fully aware, can you tell us more about the Dajon Edwards situation?
Yeah, I understand that's a hamstring too. Which makes you wonder a little bit about the training, the Scott Sinclair training. I mean, gosh, they pushed those guys so hard. Last year it was foot injuries. This year you got a couple running backs from hamstrings. Or to Jake's point, it's just bad luck. But unfortunately, yeah, and I believe Connor's also written about Dajon being limited in observation, and then, of course, what our sources told us about Dajon Edwards also being limited with the hamstring as well.
We talked about, before you joined us, FanDuel, online sportsbooks, got some national championship odds up, and, it kind of tells the picture that we expect to see, that right now there's there's a very big gap between Georgia and almost any other championship contender for the upcoming season. Georgia's about 2-1 right now. Alabama, the next team on the list, is at 5-1. That's a little larger of a gap than you oftentimes see between the top two teams for the national championship. Ohio State's at 7-1. Those are the only three teams that have odds shorter than 10-1 to win this year's title. You get to, I'm just giving you this, my Michigan 10-1, USC 16-1, FSU's 18-1, LSU's at 18-1. You got Clemson, Penn State both at 20-1. When you look out there, Mike, obviously Georgia's going to be the favorite in this year's national championship. Who do you kind of view biggest threat there? Is it an SEC team? Is it one of these Big Ten teams we've seen Georgia play in the playoff before? Is it a newcomer to the party? Nationally, what's interesting to you outside of Georgia right now?
Well, it's the last year of the 14 playoffs, and I think it's easier to win a national championship in a 14 playoff than a 12-team playoff, personally. So this Georgia team does look built for another championship run. so I understand why the odds are what they are. It's Georgia against Alabama doesn't. We don't know who their quarterback is. That's the issue with Alabama, Brandon. I mean, we know they're stacked. We've seen their recruiting classes. We know they reload. We don't know much about these new coordinators either. You got a new quarterback and a new offensive coordinator and a new defensive coordinator, and an Alabama team coming off losses to LSU and Tennessee. So I don't know that I feel good about Alabama as the second favorite. I kind of like Ohio State, but again, another program where we have to answer the question at quarterback. We saw the rest of the Buckeyes are capable. We saw that they were able to play Georgia even at the line of scrimmage. We know that. We know there's talent there, and we certainly know there's desire, as if they needed any more motivation. So the biggest threat to me, to Georgia, and this sounds trite, is Georgia. It's Georgia. It's making sure that your leadership continues to evolve, which I've been very impressed with how Georgia has moved forward after the very well documented off-field incidents. Jamon Dumas-Johnson, still need to hear from JDJ. To me, that's kind of the final piece of the puzzle that I need to see click before I'm like completely all in. But all the other leaders, all the other players that I've heard from, this is a team that has moved on and is upholding itself to a different standard. I'm hearing this is a team that moves even faster on the practice field. We know there's a lot of talent there. We've got questions, right? The running back room makes me wonder if they're going to get a transfer running back just to make sure. You certainly don't want to be shorthanded there in the season. Feel good about the incoming transfers at receivers, particularly love it. Feel great about the quarterback situation. Feel good about the line of scrimmage. Georgia's its own biggest threat, Brandon. They need to continue to evolve, have good leadership and direction. And if Georgia stays locked in and answers all those questions, I do think they're the biggest force to be reckoned with, and I would favor them to win the national championship.
So if I was going to bet on a non-Georgia team on the list that we just saw there, especially given the odds, the team that interests me most is probably LSU, because I agree with you. I mean, we saw Alabama lose 2 regular season games a year ago. It's not obvious to me they're still the same level of national championship contender they've been in the past. The Big Ten stuff's going to work itself out. I don't know that I have a strong opinion about that as of yet. But I do think year 2 of Brian Kelly could be pretty interesting, especially if they find a role for Garrett Nussmeier. I don't think that Jaden Daniels is a national championship level quarterback, even when he's healthy. But I do think a combination of Daniels and Nussmeier could be kind of an interesting little package there if Brian Kelly can find a way to make that work. I think the non-Georgia team that probably interests me most right now is probably LSU.
I would agree with that. The only thing, the reason I would pick a different team is just because LSU's in the SEC and they have a tougher road. And while you're saying that Jaden Daniels isn't a national championship quarterback, somewhere Stetson Bennett is laughing because Jaden Daniels is absolutely talented if he's surrounded with the kind of talent that Georgia had. But I don't think LSU is built like Kirby Smart's 6th and 7th year Georgia teams. I'll tell you what, my wild card, and this is coming out of left field, and the only reason I'm going with this team is because they have a quarterback coming back, and I think the quarterback situation absolutely sunk this program. And my clue to you is, see that field right there? You're going to be throwing touchdowns right there, dog. I think now that program has a legitimate quarterback, and we know they're in the easiest conference out there. Maybe Florida State a little bit more of a threat. I think Clemson is my dark horse for the college football championship next year.
By the way, FanDuel's also got LSU right now at under 8.5 wins, with the juice in the over at -1.
Hey, Brandon, I know where you're going with that one, Brandon. I know where you're going.
I would say it's probably worth a look. I would say that indeed. Let me also kind of follow up on something you just said a moment ago, because I know you wrote this the other day there as well, about the idea of transfer portal for running back, but you're not going to the transfer portal just for a hamstring, though. I mean, it's not like Milton's going to miss the year, though, right? I mean, that would seem to be a pretty damning statement if you were to go to the transfer portal on a running back just because you had a couple guys dealing with hamstrings during the spring, right?
Well, I think it also has to do with maybe wanting a running back that can catch the ball, right? If there's one thing, and I think Kendall Milton can, by the way, but Dejan, to me, I didn't think looked great at that. He didn't look like a guy that was going to get downfield on a wheel. Just didn't, he just a churner, a slasher, and I love watching Dejan running. He just, wears people down. He runs hard. He's small. He's elusive. He gets behind. But I don't see him as that pass-catching back. Certainly neither the heavy Broderick or Roderick Robinson, your Branson or Roderick Robinson. I don't feel like either one of those guys is your marquee back. So you get another back for two reasons. One, to give you some diversity, in addition to Kendall as the guy that can catch the ball effectively, but 2, to give you that healthy body, that veteran body that's done it, been there, done it somewhere before. And the third reason, I'll give you another one. Kirby Smart loves his special teams, and when we think about players that are special team standouts, running backs are typically some of the best athletes on the team, running backs and linebackers. I mean, those are the last guys that you want to run into in an alley, quite literally. And you need those guys on your special teams units. And Georgia's this is 2 years in a row where we're talking about running back depth. And that's got to be getting old and irritating to Kirby, certainly Mike Bobo. I just feel like that's an itch that needs to be scratched. Hamstrings, to your point, it's not an ACL or an MCL or anything, that like Andrew Paul is still recovering from. But it is a recurring injury. And not only does it recur physiologically, but mentally. And I think Kendall had gotten over it mentally, and I think he'll bounce back again. But hamstrings, once one pops on you, and I don't know if you had that displeasure or not. It happened to me in my, not coincidentally, last year playing, men's travel ball. Once it goes, you don't hit the gas the same again for a while. It's kind of a hand on hot stove effect.
Let me follow up on this real quick because I do want to talk about one more subject if we have time. But I think you bring up an interesting point as it relates to like catching the football. We talked about this yesterday. To me, this is the one thing that no one's talking about enough around Georgia, and this would be true if Dejan and Kendall were both fully healthy. This would still be the topic. Is you had Sony Michel in 2017. You had James Cook after that. You had Kenny McIntosh after that. Georgia always has that really versatile weapon at the running back spot who becomes a really good pass catcher to go along with also running the football there as well. And I don't know that role is clearly defined on this year's team. Even if Milton and Edwards are both healthy, I think that role, the McIntosh, Cook, Sony role is still kind of undefined. So on the one hand, that's a pretty big deal. But on the other hand, Mike, if you would have told me when he was coming out of high school that Kenny McIntosh would be the next James Cook at Georgia, the next Sony Michel at Georgia, that's not the way I thought he was built. I thought he was built a little bit different than that, and he actually turned out to be a great athlete at the running back position. I think he slimmed down some, which helped him do that. But his profile kind of changed while he was at Georgia. So on the one hand, you got to find this guy who can do that stuff for you. But on the other hand, the emergence of Kenny McIntosh shows that sometimes the guy who ends up being that really versatile weapon can be a surprise.
Well, he was a surprise to a lot of us because he flew under the radar in recruiting, and Georgia was on him late. But he actually played a lot of receivers. So Del McGee knew what he was getting. But I don't think, to your point, I think the expectations for Kenny were a little lower. I mean, you had where people were blinded by the 5-star rating of Zamir, and James was a 5-star, and Kenny was kind of viewed as a second-tier back. It's kind of a joke in the family now that Alabama actually wrote that on a piece of paper when he was on a recruiting visit there. His uncle spied the recruiting list of running back rankings on the then running back coach's list. And they saw they had Kenny rated as a second-tier back. They literally wrote first-tier, second-tier, third-tier, and had names written down beneath it. And that's when the McIntosh family decided that not only were they not going to Alabama, but they were some good day going to beat Alabama. That lit the fuse. But Kenny was actually a receiver in high school and caught a lot of balls. So I think Dell knew what he was getting. But to your point, Kenny did develop over the course of time. Remember, he played on special teams as a return guy. That's another question for me. Like, who's the return guys now? I don't, that's an area that's kind of sort of been missing. I think Ladd's too valuable to put back there on punt return this year. I think you've got to maybe groom someone else for that role. Obviously, Karras moving on. Kick return, when's the last time we really held our breath? McCole Hardman days, perhaps? So that's another reason why I like that portal. Is there someone else on the team, to your point, that could develop or grow or be moved into that? I mean, I look at maybe Brock Bowers, maybe use him a little bit more of an H-back. I mean, my goodness, he's Captain America. He does everything else. But then who do you play at tight end? Is Delp ready for the Brock Bowers position, or Lawson Lucky perhaps? So there's a few different ways that you can cut this pie. But I agree with you. They need to find an answer for a receiver out of the backfield.
All right, let me do this very quick because I've kept you long, but I thought you had a good piece the other day, DawgNation.com, and it's very similar to something we talked about here, where when Kirby goes to Macon, he gets asked in that Q&A by a fan about the 3 permanent opponents for Georgia. Kirby sort of took the old school Bobby Bowden mantra of anybody, anywhere, anytime. He says, I'll just play who you give me. In so many words, that's what he said. Whereas Nick Saban took a completely different tact about, the idea that Alabama in the permanent opponent world may play LSU and Tennessee and Auburn each and every year. And, Mike, we're obviously a partisan show here, DawgNation Daily. We're pro-Georgia. But in this particular case, I think the Georgia argument is better than the other here of, if I'm an Alabama fan and I've got Nick Saban nervous about playing every year opponents that Alabama historically been beating every year, I sort of wonder as a Bama fan, what does Saban know that we don't? Why are these games about to be tougher now than they used to be, for Alabama? If I'm a Bama fan, that makes me nervous. The idea that Kirby Smart, seemingly by appearances, doesn't care who Georgia plays, that level of confidence and that level of, disregard for this as a topic, I think sort of speaks to the arrow pointing up for Georgia as a program, and I know you wrote about this as well.
Yeah, well, I'll say this, Brandon, and I love me some Kirby Smart when he speaks because he's so raw. But I also think he's very transparent. I feel like I can read Kirby Smart pretty good, and this is what we both know about Kirby Smart. Kirby Smart doesn't worry about much outside of what's in front of him the next 3 feet. Okay, so when it comes to scheduling, Kirby's not looking beyond this season. And let's be frank here. Florida ain't what they used to be. Kentucky ain't the scariest draw, and Auburn is in a rebuild. That's who Georgia has right now. I don't think I would be caring or complaining either. Saban, meanwhile, perhaps on his last legs, has Brian Kelly to deal with. Who I think Brian Kelly's an absolute monster. I think he's the Loch Ness monster of the West. I think he's the guy to fear. That's the future. That's the big hurdle coming up for everybody. He did, So he's got Tennessee on a rebound. He's got Brian Kelly, and then he's got that irritating Auburn team that can be just so terrible, and yet somehow everybody circles the wagons, and they play incredible when they play Alabama. So I guess what I'm saying is I kind of understand why Nick Saban's looking at this like, wait a minute, how do we get out? And if I'm Kirby, I'm absolutely playing it this way because right now it benefits Georgia. And so now if Kirby was dealt a different hand, if Kirby had Tennessee, Alabama, and LSU as the permanent, I don't quite know that he would have the same take. So I enjoy Kirby, but I absolutely think he's playing poker and really sticking it to Nick when he's got the opportunity, as he should.
Well, listen, I'm always in favor of sticking it to Nick Saban. So, Mike, I appreciate your time on our show today. We'll look forward to reading a bunch more from you at DawgNation.com. Obviously, spring practice rolling on. We're getting closer to G-Day, and there'll be plenty of fun stuff to talk about between now and then. So we'll see you next time right here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
I appreciate it, Brandon.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Our producer, Michael Carvel, is very happy right now because for one of the first times ever, we were able to successfully hang up on Mike before he hung up on us, and so we didn't have to hear the dial tone over the air. That's something we've talked about before, and so there you go there on that. Hey, real quick on the Saban Smart front before we kind of change the subject here. I mean, most coaches are self-serving with how they speak in public. They have a reason for saying what they say. We understand that. One of the things I do like about Kirby in comparison to Saban, I feel like Kirby's pretty consistent. I feel like Kirby kind of has a little bit of a mindset and sort of sticks with it, whereas I feel like that Nick Saban, like a politician, is more than happy to let his opinion completely reverse course depending on whichever way the wind is blowing. It's one of the reasons why it was so obvious to me last week that Saban had an ulterior motive about his comments about wrong place, wrong time, even though he tried to pretend otherwise, because his way of handling the Tony Mitchell situation is so different than the way he's handled previous discipline issues. Mitchell all of a sudden, in so many, matter of words, gets the book thrown at him, whereas, a year ago we have Jermaine Burton on video punching a woman and nothing happened to Burton. But all of a sudden it sort of benefited Saban to kind of appear to be tough on discipline, so therefore that's what he did, even though his previous behavior totally contradicts that. Well, it's the same thing going on here as it relates to the scheduling stuff. For a long time, Nick Saban was very public and open about the fact that he wanted the SEC to move to a 9-game conference schedule. He said that openly, publicly, many times. And now it appears the SEC is going to do the thing that Saban once said he wanted to. But now he's whining about playing LSU and Auburn and Tennessee each and every year, despite the fact that they've been playing each and every year forever. And all of a sudden, those games are hard now. It's just an example of Nick Saban really having no, I would say, principles other than what matters to him in the moment. And I do think that makes Kirby Smart different than him. In this particular case, I think the different is better. All right, with that said, let's shift gears here and go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And obviously what we know is going to be better there as well for all of us who get a chance to be on board the second ever DawgNation cruise coming up in we're inside of a month now. It seemed like for a long time we were months and months away, but now we're like well inside of a month. It's April 24th. We'll be going down to Port Canaveral, getting on board Independence of the Seas, going to Perfect Day Coco Cay, going to Nassau in the Bahamas, getting that 4-night experience. And my kids right now are so mad at me. Oh, my gosh, they're so mad at me because they're going to be in school and I'm being on board Independence of the Seas. That's enough to make them manage at their daddy, as you might imagine. But I do try to tell them, hey, all of this just a precursor to the fact that my family, along with my mom and my brother and his family, we're all going to be on board Independence of the Seas again coming up on June, taking one of those short 3-night, kind of over a weekend type sailings. That's one of the cool things about Royal Caribbean. Whatever fits your schedule at the moment, the 3-night sailing that goes over the weekend, the 4-night sailing if you want kind of a nice taste of cruising, or if you're ready for the big boy, 7 nights, you can do all of that, hit all kinds of Caribbean destinations. Whichever one suits you the best, Royal Caribbean's there for you. And in fact, Royal Caribbean has recommended a great travel agent that can make that process even more seamless and even more enjoyable by booking with someone who really knows the Royal Caribbean product and the service they provide up and down. That is our friend Jessica Slater. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. Jessica will take good care of you. And whatever Royal Caribbean cruise seems right for you, she can help make it happen for you. So check her out today and check Royal Caribbean out, indeed, including January of 2024, the debut of Icon in the Seas. And I got to tell you, this is self-serving, but I'm really crossing my fingers that I get a chance to maybe be on board that experience very, very soon in 2024. Hoping for that as a possibility. We'll see if that happens. All right, so with that said, let's go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. There is something interesting happening today. I'm going to try to make this interesting to you, and we'll do it quickly. There are some NCAA officials who are meeting on Congress to discuss name, image, likeness. There is still a hope in the part of the NCAA that some sort of federal legislation could be put together that kind of handles kind of a blanket policy for NIL across the landscape of the entire country here. The NCAA has a new president. That president has a political background, former governor of Massachusetts. And so they're going to try to use, I guess, the lever of politics here to get some change that comes to NIL. And look, you kind of know the story here. Most people are anti-NCAA, and I think based on opinion polling and things like that, when it comes to like the NIL stuff and things like that, you know, I think that the majority of people who have an opinion on this are of the opinion that the NCAA's kind of approach to this has been wrong. So pretty clearly the NCAA's got an uphill fight. But one of the things that's been pushed, I know that Dennis Dodd had a story about this at CBSSports.com the other day. One of the things that's being pushed on the part of the sort of NCAA folks here is there isn't enough transparency as it relates to NIL. There was a quote from a administrator somewhere that says the one thing we know about NIL is everybody lies about it. And a statement like that creates some cynicism on the part of other people of, you know, why do you have to be so negative about this? Why can't you just embrace the change, embrace the new stuff? But I'll just give you one quick opinion and we'll move on. I do think there's an element in which more transparency for NIL would actually benefit the players here. I do think the lack of truthfulness, the lack of candor, the lack of transparency as it relates to who's getting what in NIL makes the act of being an athlete and trying to be on a football team more frustrating because you're hearing so-and-so somewhere else is getting so-and-so dollars, and that makes you dissatisfied with your current situation. But we could find out that, no, that was a lie. Nick Saban, you know, on one side of his mouth is talking about paying Bryce Young $1 million. On the other side of his mouth says we're not paying guys anything. You know, over the course of time, you just see so many exaggerated claims in terms of the absence of NIL or the presence of NIL or whatever else. I think a little bit more transparency, I think, would help players make a more informed decision about where they want to play and their ability to kind of maintain some sort of contentment, satisfaction with where they are. I think that would be aided as well if we just had a little bit more open. I mean, I would be in favor. I mean, every year we publish a list of salaries for like coaches and assistant coaches and things like that. To me, there ought to be an open database somewhere that also lists the amount of money that NIL players or the players getting paid via NIL. I think that would give us more information on that. You know, we hear about, well, so-and-so got this Ferrari, but what you find out is, well, that Ferrari was actually just, you know, leased. That person's net worth didn't go up. They just were given the chance to drive the Ferrari for a year, and all of a sudden you realize, well, actually, that's not nearly as much money, you know, from a monetary value as I thought it was. Just an example of one of the things that kind of exists out there. So I think that more transparency would be better. I don't know that this congressional hearing is going to lead to that, but I think fighting for a little bit more openness and a little bit more honesty about NIL would probably serve everybody pretty well. By the way, speaking of recruits who could earn some NIL money, there's interesting news here involving players with Georgia offers. I'll start with Deuce Robinson. You remember him as kind of the lone name of note remaining from the class of 2023, the tight end from Arizona. who's also a baseball prospect of some note. This is a very, very impressive player who could kind of be maybe even like a Brock Bowers type mold if he were to come to Georgia. Robinson is getting ready to make his announcement. Hayes Fawcett, who does so many of the edits here on this, saying that he's going to announce his commitment on Thursday, March 30th. That's obviously tomorrow. And so you see all the schools have offered him. This is sort of thought to be, I think, a Georgia-USC battle. And at this point in time, as I say all the time jokingly, coaches sometimes say this to each other, I guess, that if you don't know, it ain't you, and you'll be hard-pressed to find anybody around there who thinks it's Georgia, which means it's probably not. At this point in time, it seems like Robinson's going to USC. I do think he would have been a very good player had he come to Georgia. At least he has the chance to be. I don't know that a player who's as interested in baseball as Robinson is would be a very good fit at a place like Georgia. That's just a fact. And listen, he's got every right to pursue whatever dream he wants to be. And if he wants to be the next Deion Sanders, if he wants to be the next Bo Jackson, then more power to him. But there's a reason why when we talk about guys who succeed in two sports, we mention names like Deion and Bo, two of the greatest athletes of all time. Hard to be in that category. But if that's what Deuce wants, then more power to him. I wish him well. I think he could have been a great player at Georgia, but that's if he focuses exclusively on football. If he has divided allegiances or divided ambitions, then maybe USC may be the better fit for him, and that may be where he goes. Then there's also this. Jake Merklinger, a quarterback from down in Savannah, is also getting ready to announce his commitment announcement. If you're watching on video, we'll show this on the screen to you there as well, saying he's going to be announcing his commitment also at Thursday, 12:05 p.m., and he's got a long list of offers there as well. Merklinger got a Georgia offer just a few weeks ago, and that kind of got some attention because obviously, we have thought Georgia was all in on five-star quarterback Dylan Raiola. The fact that Merklinger is getting ready to announce his commitment here with the Raiola thing still unresolved, I think would once again reinforce the thing we've all kind of thought, which is that Georgia is all in on Dylan Raiola. I don't know where Merklinger is going to go. Internet says Tennessee. Who am I to argue with that? We'll find out tomorrow. But despite the fact that Merklinger recently got a Georgia offer, Georgia does not appear to be that big of a factor here in all of this, and it just kind of reinforces what we said we knew, which is that Georgia is going after five-star quarterback Dylan Raiola. So kind of all in, all the chips on the table after Raiola taking an official visit. Well, I think we're told, beginning of June. Commitment decision for Raiola coming shortly after that. So going to be a very interesting summer as Georgia goes after a five-star quarterback, content to let a guy like Merklinger go elsewhere. Of course, Georgia's also got the commitment from Ryan Puglisi out of Connecticut there as well. One more note to give you there, too. So we showed you the screen grab early in the show of Heather Dinich and her statement about, what was it she said, that Tennessee came within an eyelash or a whisper, whatever that was, of making the college football playoff. I don't know that many, even neutral observers, would describe it that way, but nonetheless, people are going to do what they're going to do. But in her little write-up about Tennessee kind of, maybe making a push for the playoff, one of the things she talked about, and this is obviously true, is that the thing that holds Tennessee back is they're just lousy on defense. They're absolutely awful on defense. And, this is that thing that's going to hang over them of if you want to be in the category of – because, like last year, Tennessee beat LSU. They go on the road and they beat LSU. But you heard me say this a moment ago. If I'm looking at kind of a team kind of off the radar to make a real push for the playoff here right now, my team would be LSU. Now, not better than Georgia necessarily. We're sort of taking Georgia out of this. And it's kind of funny that none of the ESPN folks seem to be giving LSU the time of day at all right now. At all. And yet when I look at the overall roster construction, I see a team in LSU that's far more balanced on both sides of the ball than what Tennessee is. And if we've learned anything from college football in kind of the post-Joe Burrow world, is that balance matters again. If you've got Joe Burrow throwing to Jamar Chase, then that's enough. That's all you need. And if you're playing like pandemic football in 2020 when no one's playing defense, then Alabama can go out there and play 7-on-7 and be just fine. But in 21 and 22, the last 2 years, balance has mattered in college football. This has been real football again. Balance has mattered, and Tennessee just doesn't have it. And listen, I think that Josh Heupel is an extraordinary offensive mind. My guess is that Tennessee probably scores a lot of points again this season. I think that's true whether Joe Milton's the quarterback or if Nico Imaleva, emerges the quarterback. And if a guy like Jake Merklinger wants to go to Tennessee strictly for that reason, then I think he's making a pretty good decision because if he can eventually become the Tennessee starter in whatever year, odds are working with Josh Heupel, they'll score points. But when you play as fast as Heupel plays, when you spread it out as much as he does it, and move at the speed they do, there is no free lunch in college football. There is always a payback for every positive thing you have. and the sacrifice that Tennessee makes on defense so the offense can do what it does, that is just obvious. It's recognizable. They give up 63 points to South Carolina. South Carolina ran out of fireworks. They were scoring so many touchdowns. And do you see any obvious reason in 2023 why that's going to change? I don't. My guess is that Tennessee remains a dangerous football team because they do score points. And if they score a lot of them on you early, then the game feels very, very different. But if you can withstand that early storm, and if you can assert yourself a little bit physically, then eventually Tennessee will probably wilt. That's what obviously happened last year in Athens, and that's what will happen again this year in Knoxville, I probably assume. So Tennessee's a defense away from being a college football playoff contender. There have been a lot of teams that have been in that spot before, and they found finding that defense very hard to do when you focus so much of your program on the offensive side. We'll make that cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Now, I will tell you this, we are enjoying ourselves this time of year, chance to be outside again, enjoying a baseball season about to start, or just patio season, back decks, golf course, things like that. Well, listen, when we're outside and enjoying ourselves, one of the things we love to take with us is our friends at the Finish Long Drink. You can enjoy all of that, whether it be the cranberry or the long drink strong, 8.5% alcohol by volume, long drink zero, no carbs, no sugar. The traditional comes in a blue can, got the citrus flavor, the grapefruit flavor, the gin kick. Boy, it's just really, really good. And you can enjoy a lot of that right now by going to thelongdrink.com. Whichever variety you think you like best, you can try it at a golf course, in your patio, at a bar, at a restaurant, whatever else. Try the Finish Long Drink if you haven't. And by the way, don't forget on Friday, we'll do our Big Finish presented by the Finish Long Drink. And for those of you who've been enjoying some Finish Long Drink, send it to me on Twitter at DawgNation Daily, and we'll highlight you as a part of the Big Finish later on this week. Okay, so let's get ready to do a golden shoe to wrap up here today. Obviously, all interest on G-Day on April 15th. I guess we're still sort of waiting to find out more about tickets for all of that. If y'all have heard something definitive on that, let me know. But what we do have now is a very cool G-Day logo. In fact, a little bit unusual for me to kind of give a golden shoe to the official account for Georgia or just the athletic department in general. They've already got plenty of awards. But we'll give them a golden shoe today because I would say this G-Day logo is, man, oh, man, a step in the right direction. Kind of a classic pennant, kind of a classic font. To be frank, a lot better than the typical font that Georgia's been using the last few years. This is just really, really sharp. And I hope this becomes kind of the G-Day logo moving forward. I think this is great. So we'll go golden shoe there on that for them today for a great G-Day logo. Gets us excited about April 15th. For those of you who can't be in the stadium, you can watch it on ESPN2 at 4 p.m. That's good news, too. Alabama streaming internet for their spring game. But nonetheless, Gatorade countdown there as well. 213 days from right now, Georgia back in Jacksonville, beating up on Florida again. That is our Gatorade countdown. We'll see you tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They will show up on time. They'll do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that. All right, I'm going to start on Facebook today, and I'm going to roll through these comments. We'll let you talk about anything you want to on the program today. Okay. Let us see what else. Oh, Barry Watkins says, I hope next year's G-Day has 3 trophies in it. Yeah, listen, I'd be all in favor of that. Just keep stacking those trophies. Mike said a moment ago that he thought the national championship was easier to win in a 14 playoff than it will be in a 12-team playoff. One thing we've talked about before is that, FCS has had an expanded playoff for quite some time. And North Dakota State has won 9 of the last 12, I think. So if Georgia can maintain its status as the best program in college football, the best team in college football, they actually might, mathematically, and you've heard us say this before, they actually might benefit from an expanded playoff more so than the shorter playoff because, over the course of the long period of time, the team with just the more resources, the deeper roster, everything else, all of a sudden that becomes, a little bit, it just maybe makes it easier to win. The bad teams eventually show themselves over the course of a 12-team playoff, 11-game sequence there in a way they would not in the other way around. Now, in the basketball tournament, when you get to like 68 teams, you have a year like this where a lot of the good teams are kind of falling by the wayside. But a 12-team playoff could be a little bit different than that. Philip Jordan Wells worried about Charlie Morton for the Braves. Yeah, I mean, obviously at this stage, Morton's kind of getting on up there a little bit. But, I mean, my excitement here kind of, I sort of touted Spencer Strider for the Rookie of the Year last year. Now, maybe in retrospect, maybe it really should have been Michael Harris the entire time. But what I love about Strider is because he is that kind of power pitching style, I mean, I think there's a chance that, A, he's going to be a huge fan favorite, kind of already is. But B, to kind of put him near the front end of that rotation with a guy like Fried, there's a chance that Strider's kind of the next big star there, which I think could be fun. Denise White and Barry Watkins, I'm at Heather Dinich here for a moment. So I've met Heather a couple of times. I don't know her well, don't know her at all, really. But she's nothing wrong with her as a person, things like that. But I will tell you, and I just mean this as bluntly as I can, I think Heather is like a lot of people in the fact that she has been victimized by bad producing. When you go on TV or when you go in some sort of public persona, you have to have an angle. You have to have a thing. Like, Danny Cannell is like the anti-SEC guy, right? And as I said before, I kind of like Danny because I kind of like pro wrestling, and the fact that Danny has like a pro wrestling gimmick, I kind of enjoy. It's just, to me, it's all funny. It's sort of a wink and a nod. That's his gimmick, and I like that. And I think, Heather being on TV and stuff a little bit more for ESPN, she's been kind of pushed into a little bit more of kind of a gimmick spot of, whatever else. I don't know, something that fits her personality very well. So I don't think there's anything wrong with her. I do think she's been victimized by bad producing. Let's see what else. And there's a lot of that, by the way. She's not the only one. There's a lot of that where, like take Takeo Spikes for a moment. Do you think that Takeo Spikes wanted to go on TV and say that South Carolina was going to beat Georgia? Do you think he wanted to do that? He got talked into doing that. That's why he backtracked on that as quickly as he could. I mean, he eventually recounted all of that he said a year ago. Wouldn't surprise me if Chris Doran kind of got pushed into predicting what Kentucky was going to go 11-1 or whatever that prediction was. And, producing one of these TV things is a hard job. I mean, you're trying to make, something that could be somewhat monotonous and mundane if you're not careful. You're trying to make it more interesting. So you are kind of coaching your talent to give the most robust opinions they can possibly give. But and if you're a young former player or, writer turned personality, then you want to impress because you want to keep this job. I mean, who wouldn't? They're well-paid positions and you get a lot of fame and attention. So you're trying to appeal to the people who are in control of your airtime, and so you just do what they say. And a lot of times what these talents are told to say is not exactly the most dignified commentary. Let's see what else. Rick Wallace says, I'm excited to see baseball because each day is one day closer to kickoff. Yeah, I understand where you're coming from on that. Where, like, to me, baseball season's really valuable because, there isn't a lot of great sports, kind of post-Masters, pre-football. There's just not a ton. The sports calendar is just not nearly as crowded in the warm weather months. So the idea of a baseball game, something you can, have on your car radio, or you can have it on the background as you're having dinner or whatever else. Just that little bit of soundtrack to kind of go with everything you do. Now, there are some people who are watching like every pitch and they're scoring at home and they're, whatever else. There are people who live and die with every moment of it, but there are also people who just like to have it around. And I mean, for me, my entire life, I just sort of feel like I can't imagine a spring and summer where that Braves baseball wasn't just sort of echoing in the background somewhere, just always around. And, you can kind of get fixated on it for the last few innings or, whatever it is that your sort of typical routine is, but it's just sort of always there. And it does help us pass the sporting time between now and the start of football, which is in itself a really good thing there too. Jamie Huff says the quarterbacks need the scrimmage. I say it hurts Brock more to not have one. My understanding is they're going to scrimmage on Saturday, I think. And as far as like what their typical spring routine is, I'll have to plead ignorance on that. About, what they did this past Saturday and how different that might have been from what they normally do. I just don't know. I mean, I don't live in Athens. I mean, in the summertime, they go to the stadium for these scrimmages, but is the stadium even open now? I don't even know that. I mean, it's I know they're doing a decent amount of construction over there. Can they even get on the field right now? I don't know the answer to that. But like the August scrimmages, they typically take place in the stadium. Phil Rogers says he has the Major League Baseball extra innings package. I bet that is fun because, I mean, baseball's got a pretty good collection of young stars right now, if you count them as young. Like what we saw at the World Baseball Classic between Shohei and Mike Trout was really cool. Padres have a good, fun nucleus of guys. The Rodriguez kid from Seattle. I mean, there's a good collection of exciting players in the sport right now. So, I mean, watching a lot of Major League Baseball seems like a really good idea to me right now. Barry Watkins, subject of Kirby yelling. It's kind of funny if you're ever in Athens, he's on that microphone and you can hear it everywhere. I mean, that thing echoes everywhere. So if you're ever like, walking around like the practice field, or if you're near the stadium on one of these days in which, Georgia's doing a scrimmage, I mean, it ain't no, like, for as secretive as Kirby wants to be about everything, there is no secret stuff whatsoever as it relates to what he yells over the microphone. Everybody hears that. And there was some chatter that he may have gotten on Smoke Buoy. I think yesterday was Law Enforcement Day for the, Georgia brings in the law enforcement folks just to kind of show support for the law enforcement, which I think is a nice thing to do. They bring in those guys, and I guess there were a lot of people who heard Kirby on the microphone just yelling at Smoke Buoy, which typically speaking is a good sign. That means, first of all, Kirby's going to get on if you're a defensive back because that's sacred turf to him. But also kind of a good sign. That must mean he must think you're a really good player. That's what he's going to do. But there had been some chatter out there that Smoke may have kind of gotten the receiving end of that yesterday. Jason Thomas says, I got the golden shoe for the Georgia theme charcuterie board a while ago. He says, shoot me a DM on Instagram. He says, I've got a project in mind for you on the show. Okay, we'll take a look at that, Jason. Thank you so much. We'll try to get that done. Absolutely. That sounds great. Sounds like a fun conversation. Travis McCullough says that I may have to subscribe to Bally Sports Plus so I can catch all the Braves games. So this is one of those things where I'm so different than so many people. In fact, that my family, we're not cord cutters. Like we're cable bundle subscribers still. And I would say, and I think I've said this before, so you got me into the sports. You got my wife who wants the HGTV stuff. You got my daughter who, she mostly just watches either Disney Plus or YouTube. But, Charlie's into, my son's kind of into his own little sports stuff too. Between the four of us, kind of four different interests, cable bundle is actually still a pretty good deal. And, I sort of think in the future, and of course, I don't come to the show for my predictions about the future, but I sort of think in the future we're kind of gravitating back towards something that looks a little bit more like a cable bundle, I think, because streaming's expensive for the companies that try, and I don't know that any of them, Netflix, Disney, Amazon Prime, I don't know that any of them are profitable. So it could be that we're kind of heading back towards something that feels a little bit more like a cable bundle. But for now, for me, I still watch sports on television like always. And I've told you before, when I do watch sports on a stream, I always find it to be pretty frustrating. It's like I'll watch the Georgia baseball games on the stream, and it's like you're flipping channels, going back and forth between TV, and then, it's almost like you have to enter, a portal in another dimension to kind of log on to, SEC Network Plus to watch the baseball games. And frankly, when we're watching movies on Disney Plus or something like that, I always feel like the rewind, the fast forward functioning on that's so different than just regular TV is, which drives me crazy. Wayne Kirkland says Hulu is hard to beat. Hulu may be one of the only platforms we don't have a subscription to. There's no telling how much we're paying for content, and 90% of it we don't watch. I mean, so our bills and stuff like that is expensive because we still have cable, we have Netflix, we have Disney. I guess we have Amazon because, we have the regular whatever. So we're paying a decent amount for content. We don't watch very much of it. But Hulu is the one we don't have. Let me go to YouTube for a moment. On YouTube, let's see what else. Foster Moss says YouTube TV. I won't be disappointed. Maybe one of these days I'll take a look at it. Taylor Russell says that Hulu is the only platform that has Lost on it. Okay, there you go. Let's see what else. Paul Moon says that he hasn't had cable since he moved out of his parents' house. Yeah, I mean, at this point in time, cord cutting is about a decade old, right? I mean, there are people who've been without cable for like a decade now. And even though we keep adding more and more streaming platforms in our house, we still have the cable. I mean, we spend a lot of money on content. I will say that. Visor says, I hope that Bobo opens up the season in the power I formation. I actually wouldn't mind that either, Visor. I think that'd be that'd be pretty interesting to see, for sure. Cousin Eddie asks a good question. He says, when Kirby wins 3 in a row, along with winning the 3 out of 4 of his appearance in the national championship game in his first 8 seasons, can we at least call him the greatest of these times, if not the greatest of all time? In other words, the GOAT, not the GOAT. Cousin, I think you're absolutely right about that. Kirby is the GOAT, greatest of these times. Nick Saban is the GOAT, greatest of all time. And it remains to be seen if Kirby Smart will one day be goated. It remains to be seen if that's going to be the case. But is he the GOAT right now? Yeah, I love that. He is the GOAT, greatest of these times, greatest of this time. And if you win the 3rd straight, then that would obviously be an emphatic statement in support of Kirby Smart being currently the best coach in college football. And so we do our 1st and 15. This was, I think, yesterday. I made a point that some people seem to not understand, which means as a professional communicator, I failed to properly convey. I think what's interesting about Kirby moving forward is now that you've won, you've at least won multiple national championships. Now, however many more multiples this is, we'll find out. But in terms of breaking the 40-year drought, that's been done. Coming back, winning another one, that's kind of another level of achievement that's been unlocked. So that second national championship, I believe, made Kirby, to use your word, GOAT. That made him greatest of this time. Whereas with just one national championship, that could have been viewed as a fluke, and Nick Saban could have held on to that status. But the next horizon for Kirby is how much he could move Georgia up the pecking order of the greatest college programs of all time. Like I think it was College Football News that did this the other day, basically looking at kind of a points system for like ranking teams in the history of the AP poll, which I believe dates back to the late 30s, I think. That's how long the AP poll's been with us. And if you give 25 points for finishing first and 1 point for finishing 25th, or back in the years when there was only 20, if you assign a point total in inverse of your ranking, and then you say, well, who are the greatest programs of all time? And Bama was first, and then you have like Michigan, Ohio State, Notre Dame, and then Georgia was 12th, which to me that seems about right in terms of the 100 whatever year history of college football. Georgia at about 12th seems about right. Near the top 10, but not quite number 1 or number 2. Historically speaking, I think that's probably about fair. Kirby's 47, 48 maybe. He's young enough. He could coach for another 20 years without really, it wouldn't even be that big of a big of a stretch to say coaching the 20 years. So over the course of that 20 years, I think we're going to talk about this on the show at one point this week. Over the course of that 20 years, winning more national championships, how much could he move Georgia up the pecking order in terms of being thought of in the history of college football as one of the very best programs that's ever existed? That's kind of the next horizon, I think, for Kirby Smart, moving from the greatest of this time and sort of establishing not just himself as an all-time coach, but establishing Georgia as a little bit more of an all-time program, kind of in that category with, some of these other programs that have a 100-plus year history. Let's see what else. Are we talking about Alabama injuries again? The Alabama injury topic, one of those things that, gosh, has been a long time running. You'd think those guys get healthy eventually. Jonathan Aaron with a good suggestion. He said, if you get a chance, go watch the clip from Pat McAfee with Nolan Smith. Yeah, you know what? I saw some of that, or I saw that it existed, and I was going to try to pull some of that just in case we wanted to use it for the show, and I did not have a chance to. So, Jonathan, I appreciate the heads up on that. I will go seek that out because I'm assuming that's probably pretty good. Thank you very much. Carter Evans says, who are 2 highly rated recruits that came to UGA and didn't pan out the way we wanted them within the Kirby Smart era outside of JT Daniels? Yeah, thankfully, hopefully there haven't been too many. I mean, I guess maybe the biggest example for me, because I was such a big fan of his, was Rick Gilbert. And obviously some of that with Rick was, kind of, a little bit more, tied to some off the field type, challenges that he was facing. But that's obviously one of those that, when he transferred to Georgia after Georgia kind of, missed out on him as a recruit the first time, I was really excited. And obviously, and G-Day a year ago, I was really excited about all of that, but clearly it didn't quite work out. Rid You Fly, we talked about Deuce Robinson during the show. Rid You Fly also reminding us, hey, right now guys like Lawson Lucky are earning a lot of buzz during camp. So in terms of already having some impressive tight ends for the class of 2023, it seems like Georgia does. I know that Pierce Spurlin's a little bit banged up and injured right now, but it seems like Lawson Lucky has earned a lot. Spencer Clark says Zamir White. So I think the definition here is kind of interesting because, Zamir White was never, one of the best players in the country, but he was also, a solid performer, a starter level player for the team that won the national championship. So, as a 5-star running back, by definition, he's considered a future first-round pick, in the NFL, and that's obviously not what Zamir worked out to be. But, this is a guy who kind of helped win the Clemson game for you in 2021, helped you put the game on ice against Alabama in the national championship. I'm pretty satisfied with the Zamir White career. I do think that second ACL slowed him down a little bit and prevented him from being what he could have otherwise been. But Zamir White had a good career at Georgia. I don't think you can put Zamir White on that list. Let's see what else. Crow King 123 says, here's my thought. Sure, he says weird ranking stuff can keep us out of the top dogs, but the way I see it, if we win next year, we are a blue blood. People won't be able to talk about the end of the about the end of the 4-team. Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt. I think on the virtue of 2 contemporary national championships go along with its history, Georgia's clearly a blue blood. And I think that a 3rd straight national championship would just be this entirely different category altogether. I think you're right about that. The other thing, too, is if you wanted to take the most pro-Georgia argument possible, that using the AP poll as the barometer for the greatest programs of all time is probably unfair to Southern teams, because if you want to go back to the 1940s and 1950s, there is very little doubt in my mind, and I've done some of the research on this, there is very little doubt in my mind that the AP poll was biased against Southern teams. It just was. There was definitely a pro-Midwestern bent to the mid-century AP poll. There just was. And so, how much does that impact the way that a team like Georgia's viewed? I don't know. So prior to Nick Saban, that also would have been the case for Alabama in comparison to Michigan, Ohio State there as well, programs like that Alabama would have sort of suffered through a time in which maybe they weren't quite as valued by the AP poll, because a lot of the Southern teams won't. Bear Bryant helped change that. Nick Saban completely eradicated that, obviously, in modern times, and that maybe wasn't the process of what Georgia's doing here right now. Visor brings up a fair point. He says, the idea of being a blue blood is something from the 1960s. I could care less about what your team did in my great-grandpa's era of college football. It's what you have done for me now. I do understand what Visor's saying. I understand that. I think, however, and I don't really disagree with what he's saying. I'm just making a different point. It's like when North Carolina is good in basketball, that kind of has an extra meaning to it because of the fact that they were blue blood back, for many, many decades, and now they're good again when they are. UCLA and basketball be kind of the same thing. So when, take Georgia out of the conversation for a minute. When an Alabama or a Michigan is really good, that seems significant because those are sort of the teams you expect to be really good, and therefore I think that is, in a roundabout way, obviously the present tense is the only thing that matters. But when the team that's good currently was also a team that's historically been good, there's just a little bit of extra oomph to that. So I do think blue blood status, to use that phrase, is kind of worth aspiring to because, the rich get richer. So once you kind of become in that rich category, well, all of a sudden now you get a chance to benefit from that status. Christopher Vale says recruits don't care much about what happened about more than 10 years ago. No, that's true. I mean, and let's keep in mind. So if you're 18 years old now, I mean, you almost weren't alive the last time, say, Florida won a national championship. Florida won a national championship in 2008. There are no current recruits that have a living memory of Florida winning a national championship. They certainly don't remember Tennessee winning one. They really don't even remember USC winning one. We think of USC as being a more contemporary program, but current recruits don't even have a living memory of that. So I think it's important to keep in mind. But donors who last for a lot longer, they do have memory of that. And, so there's still some benefit in sort of blue blood status because of what that does to the adults around the program. It gets, donors and things like that more excited, things like that. Christopher Vale says NIL is going to fortify all the blue bloods eventually. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true, but I also see examples of, it's like, in some cases, like, okay, so we don't see Drake May leave North Carolina. There's been this chatter of, he's going to get millions of dollars. He's going to go somewhere else and transfer, but he didn't. The Tulane quarterback didn't do that either. So, I think it's still maybe a little bit too early to predict exactly what kind of impact that the NIL stuff is going to have on college football. Obviously, the sort of rich blue blood programs are in a position to, see their lead potentially increase over everybody else. But, I don't know that's currently the way all this is at least playing out here right now. I'm not sure. All right, let me go to DawgNation.com, and then we'll do a couple final comments here. All right, on DawgNation.com. I had to get logged back in over here. Andrew Sisson says Kirby could also be how are we going to say this? The GOCT, the greatest of the current time, or the GN, greatest now. There you go. Jack says we need to be like the A team, like the G team. He says that I would be. So he says, so for those of you who remember the A Team action series in the 80s, he says I would be B.A. Baracus because of the same name. Connor would be Face. Centel is Murdoch, and Griff is Hannibal. I mean, Griff is by far and away the oldest, so I guess that makes him Hannibal. I say that in loving kindness. I'm just kidding. But I wonder. Centel would be Murdoch. So Murdoch was howling mad. Is Jeff Centel howling mad? And plus, B.A. was also incredibly tough, something I'm probably not considered to be. Connor would be the Dirk Benedict character Face. That's an interesting thing. That's interesting. First of all, a big fan of the A Team back then, so I could have that conversation for a while for sure. I wouldn't mind being thought of as Hannibal. I wouldn't mind being Hannibal. I love it when a plan comes together. I wouldn't mind being that. Keith Dog says, I eat off the floor, literally. I'm not proud of that. I'm a true dog. Yeah, listen, I got no problem. I mean, a lot of times I'm eating a sandwich for breakfast. Almost every day I'm eating like a sandwich for breakfast. And, it's like you got like the bacon, the egg, and the cheese. If a piece of bacon falls out of the sandwich, you better believe I'm getting that bacon right back. I mean, I'll eat that off the floor. That's good protein. I'm not leaving that laying on the floor. I'm picking that up for sure. Let's see what else. Richard D. says, could anyone speak at this NCAA Congress hearing today? And what would you say if you were given the opportunity to speak? That's a good question. So the people who've been invited, I saw the list. Like it's mostly, it's mostly like sort of peripheral figures. The only like football name of note I saw is it Trey Burton? That's the former Florida receiver. I guess he's the only like football representative I even saw. You have a lot of like athletic directors from like middle tier places or softball players, something like that. It's kind of a weird hodgepodge of people. But if I was invited to speak, it's the transparency part that I want to speak on, because I'm just telling you right now, there are a lot of players who've been led to believe a bunch of phony stuff when it comes to NIL. The biggest example is Jaden Rashada last year, and when he was of the belief that somebody at Florida is going to give him, what was the crazy figure it was, $13 million, whatever that was clearly false. And I've seen some like national sports writer types who've kind of taken the tact of, well, he should have known that was false. But here's the point. He's an 18-year-old kid, and his parents have never been through this kind of stuff before. I mean, it's like the most grotesque form of elitism to act like that someone like that ought to, know what everybody else knows when it comes to NIL when they don't live in that world every single day. And if some of these reporter types would be a little bit more forthcoming about, the actual truth of NIL, then people like Rashada might be able to make a more informed decision. And that's my concern here, is that right now, as it relates to the revenue opportunities that are out there, I just don't think players are capable of making as an informed of a decision as I'm sure they'd like to be able to make, because so much of the reporting is just erroneous. It's just fabulous, reporting, because big numbers sound good in a news story, and nobody really wants to burn their sources. So there's no critical thinking whatsoever in terms of sort of regurgitating these NIL claims, because that would make the story seem less interesting. And so that's what I'd like to see improve. Randy Hall says, who's your biggest overachiever for Georgia, with the exception of Stetson, Chris Smith, Ladd, Eric Stokes? So those are obviously some pretty big exceptions. So if you take them out, how about Warren McClendon? Now, McClendon was a pretty good recruit coming out of high school, but Warren McClendon was also a rock-solid starter on a back-to-back national championship team. And, I think his performance well outpaced the attention he got as a recruit. He kind of came to Georgia as a little bit of a legacy-type name, and so he had some fans because of that. But this is not somebody that everybody sort of had penciled in as a can't-miss prospect. And my gosh, what a starter he became. Does that fit okay with that? Richard D says, if I were in agreement with Mike about a veteran transfer running back, who would I pursue? I mean, I like Tank Bigsby a lot, but I don't think Bigsby's leaving Auburn right now. I think they're going to probably feature him this year. And as far as, and that's kind of the issue with the portal, is I think that over the course of last year, and I think you maybe have heard me say this before, I don't think the portal shoppers were all that pleased with the supply. I just think that in terms of like sort of SEC level, big time talents, I just don't know how much of that there's really been. So at any position for Georgia to consider a transfer, it'd have to be, you see what, Darian Kendrick was from Clemson, what, a guy like Dominic Lovett has a chance to be right now. These are big time players. It takes that sort of level of performance, because other transfers who maybe, we thought had decent credentials but had never proven to the SEC level, oftentimes those are the guys that end up not really being heard from at all. Let's see what else. So in my opening segment, this is our question from our producer, Michael Carvel. You said that Georgia was a heavy favorite to repeat as champs. Since the Dogs have already repeated, is there a more powerful verb you could consider or create? Well, obviously, eventually we're going to get to go for 3 in 23, but technically speaking, they are going to repeat again if they do win. It'll just be a repeat of the repeat. I guess they're going to repeat, yeah, it's going to be the repeat there. So yes, indeed, and eventually we're going to have a nice, shiny, brand new logo for Go for 3 and 23 and all that. I promise that's on its way. We may do it slightly different this year. We've been talking about this. Paul Moon says NIL is great for a number of reasons, in my opinion, especially for guys who will be good college players but won't sniff the NFL, and for kids who could really use some money sooner rather than later. Yeah, I would think that for the most part that's kind of true. And and I think that NIL is probably a little bit more of a present factor in some players' lives than maybe you might think. And I do think it makes a difference. I do. Jonathan Aaron says, I know with all that Jimbo Fisher money that I've collected, my family and I are going to be going to California this weekend for WrestleMania. We will not be there for that, but I am kind of excited about this year's WrestleMania. I think this has a chance to be a better WrestleMania than we've seen. So I'm semi-excited about this year's WrestleMania. I am. I think that Cody and Roman for the main event. I think that this to me feels like a WrestleMania main event, and in recent years, I'm not really quite so sure how often that's been true. So I'm decently excited for WrestleMania this year. Cassie Turner says, I think the NIL maybe should have more rules and parameters than it does right now. I think the regulation is lacking a bit. I think that's the case. And listen, unfortunately, everybody benefits from the secrecy. Everybody does. I mean, most of these programs don't want people knowing what's really going on. They don't. They want to be able to operate in secrecy. And that's just a fact. They just want that. And, you know, transparency wouldn't just be interesting for us who obviously are interested in this topic, but it would also, I think, benefit the players because, you know, all of this new stuff that's being implemented around college athletics, I don't think people spend a whole lot of time thinking about how this benefits players. And like the transfer portal is a perfect example of this, is that most of the people who are in favor of like really liberal transfer rules, I don't mean politically liberal, I mean, you know, liberal as opposed to like rigid. Those who are kind of favoring sort of open transfer rules. I think they're into that because they want to be for the players. But the same people who don't ever anticipate any unintended consequence with anything also don't anticipate unintended consequences with these kinds of policies either. And what I can tell you is that the transfer portal has been good for some players, but it's also created a lot more problems for other players. Like I do high school football each and every week, and I can promise you this, for the coaches at the high school level who are working so hard to get their players in a college scholarship somewhere, not Georgia, not Alabama, not Ohio State, but just on a scholarship somewhere on somebody's college football roster, I can promise you this, those coaches hate the transfer portal because there are plenty of group of 5 teams, FCS teams, they're not recruiting high school kids at all. So the idea that transfer portal is good for players, well, it's not good for those players because they're not getting a chance to be players right now. And in the universe of college athletics, we sort of forget this, that there are, thousands of college football players. You know, we focus on a couple of hundred, but there are thousands of them, across the board. And it doesn't take very long for the transfer portal to become good for a tiny few fraction of players and kind of problematic for a lot of others. And by the way, even a lot of people who've utilized the transfer portal will tell you, you know, this actually didn't work out the way I thought I was going to. About 70% or so of the guys in the transfer portal don't have anywhere to transfer to. And a good number of the players that do land in the spot, like look at Ole Miss, for example. Ole Miss has 3 transfer quarterbacks. Jackson Dart, who came last year, Walker Howard, and Spencer Sanders, who came this year. That means 2 of the quarterbacks that used their one-time transfer to go to Ole Miss, 2 of those quarterbacks are going to end up sitting the bench for it. So, you know, just an example of what we're talking about here, which is that, hey, you know, being pro NIL means being pro player, but it's not obvious it's working out very well for everybody. And certainly in the case of the transfer portal, you can prove that. Let's see what else. Christopher Vale on the subject of the one free transfer. Mike Gundy was talking about this the other day, that according to Gundy, and I think that there's some other people would probably agree with this, that the one-time transfer rule is basically not worth the paper that's printed on because, you know, for the players who transfer and use their one time and then transfer again, they're just going to sue the NCAA, and the NCAA is going to cave under the lawsuits. This is basically what Gundy said. Is that Gundy said the other day that basically you're going to have to start creating scholarship offers that function like contracts, and you can sign a 1-year contract or a 4-year contract or something in between that. But, you know, Gundy was kind of advocating more for contracts as it relates to some of these scholarships. Now, the, you know, sort of egghead types are going to come back and say, well, we're going to do that. You're going to have to have collective bargaining, which maybe that's where that's all going. That is certainly where a lot of the media is pushing this to go, open in their advocacy. They are certainly, pushing this to go that way. But as I said before, the same people who never consider the unintended consequences on any issue are not anticipating the unintended consequences on this either. That, the idea that all of this is heading towards some sort of thing where the players finally get to be counted as employees, something that some people are pushing hard for. A lot of these players may not like the world they live in once they are characterized as employees as opposed to student athletes the way they're thought of right now, and that is just how the world works. All right, let me do a few more here. Ken Holcomb says the portal is ruining NCAA football. Make a commitment and stick with it. I would say the good news here right now is, the silver lining on all this is that the last 12 months have actually been slightly less chaotic with the transfer portal than I think some of us thought it would be. Still somewhat chaotic. Georgia lost, dozen or so players off this past year's team or something along those lines. Pretty much everybody in the SEC lost at least 12. I guess Georgia didn't lose quite that many. But most teams lost, a handful of players. And Georgia added a couple of players. But I'd say over the course of the last year, the good news is that the portal thing hasn't been quite as chaotic as maybe we thought it would. And some of these teams that, took tons of portal players, what they found out is, in the case of Alabama a year ago, that actually didn't help your team chemistry very much, I don't believe. Or what, like, say, Mel Tucker did at Michigan State to be really good one year, that the following year there wasn't a whole lot of carryover for that. Or, programs that probably wanted to take a bunch of transfer players didn't really find a lot of SEC level players to take. So while there are certain things with the transfer portal I don't love, I guess from a silver lining standpoint, the last year or so hasn't quite been as chaotic as maybe it could have been. Now the basketball portal is a completely different story, I think. All right, let's see what else. West J Dog fan on the subject of the WrestleMania main event. I would be very surprised if Cody Rhodes doesn't win. And as a 1980s, hardcore Saturday night 6:05 WTBS wrestling watcher, to see a Rhodes with the WWE Championship would be maybe a big deal for me. It would be a big deal. I mean, there's certain things about Cody I probably don't love, but would I like to see a Rhodes on top of the wrestling world? I think I probably would. And is Roman taking time off after WrestleMania? So I guess that probably gives you all you need to know about that. I mean, if Roman wins again, I think people are going to be pretty disappointed. Let's see what else. Memphis Dog says if coaches can leave, players should be able to leave as well. That is the argument that probably wins 90% of these discussions, is that whatever chaos exists with the players also exists with the coaches. And for the life of me, I don't understand how the coaches have been able to get – and listen, I'm pro-coach. I think coaches are valuable. I think they should be paid a lot of money. I think there aren't enough good ones to go around, so clearly the ones who are good have additional leverage over some of the ones that are not. And what we don't oftentimes see is we see coaches constantly getting new jobs or getting raises, things like that. What we don't see is down at the bottom of college football, every year there's a crop of coaches that fall out of coaching and can't get back in. We don't see the full hierarchy because we only focus on a few names at the top. But 131 FBS schools, each with 10 coaches, that's 1,300 coaches in the industry. There is a crop of coaches at the bottom of the ladder who fall out of coaching and can't get back in. So this is a hierarchy based on competency. So that's part of why the coaches that we talk about, the famous coaches, have all this leverage when it comes to contracts. But even understanding all of that, it is still amazing to me that coaching contracts are so generous, not in terms of the money, but in terms of the fact that they can seemingly break them anytime they want to. And there's very little retribution about any of that kind of thing. So I kind of see Memphis Dog's point on this, which is that if you want to hold players to some sort of standard, it seems fair that you might hold coaches to some sort of standard there as well, but nobody seems to have any desire to do that at all, which I think is really interesting. Let's see what else. Spencer Clark says, players the foundation, not the coach. A player should have an obligation. A coach is a job. Spencer Clark says the Dogs are recruiting Idaho's top player. I guess it's one of the final frontiers for Georgia there on that. All right, it's very late here. Let me get G. Grace here, who says that a freshman NIL should be capped off. She should be able to use that for recruiting. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm not really. I don't know. It's hard to sort of say, what I want to think about that. Because on the one hand, like, I'm not really in favor of a lot of hard caps necessarily on things. I mean, I'm not that worried about restricting the NIL because I think the NIL stuff's mostly exaggerated. But if I could restrict the transfer portal, I would. I guess that's ultimately what it comes down to. And when certain places leverage NIL for transfer portal, that's when it gets a little tricky for me. And by the way, I think that talking about transparency in NIL, I think we should ought to be calling out some of these people who end up not living up to their promises because there's plenty of that we've heard rumors going on of so and so went somewhere, he thought he was getting X number of dollars and he didn't get it. We ought to be able to tell those stories too because one way or another the truth needs to come out. All right, anything else? Back on Facebook just for a second. Now they're just sort of shouting out old wrestlers. Bret the Hitman Hart, Mr. Wrestling number 2. So back in the day, Mr. Wrestling number 2 was a wrestler that wore a mask and kind of a famous independent wrestler. But I was always told there were like 4 Mr. Wrestling number 2s. And so, like at Disney World, Mickey Mouse, if he's one park, he's not at another park. That's kind of the thing. It's like Mickey Mouse only one place at a time. It sounds like Mr. Wrestling number 2 was not held to the same standard, that Mr. Wrestling number 2 would be wrestling in Dothan, Alabama and Chattanooga, Tennessee on the same night because there were apparently 4 guys wearing the Mr. Wrestling number 2 outfit. That's what I heard anyway. Joe Moody says, if I were doing my list of top 10 athletes of all time, would I include a wrestler? He says it's a no for me. No professional bowlers on my list either. So, Joel, on the one hand, I don't know that I have a wrestler in my all-time top 10, although Ric Flair would be close. But on the other hand, you can't put bowling and wrestling in the same category, unless you're talking about, who was the guy a couple of years ago in the bowling that was so into wrestling? I guess maybe if you're talking about him, that's a little bit different. Philip Jordan Wells also remembering the great Brooklyn brawler, whose given name was Steve Lombardi. Philip, that's who you're looking for. Steve Lombardi was the Brooklyn brawler. All right, we got to go. Good stuff. Appreciate all of you being here. Go check out the Atlanta Journal-Constitution online at ajc.com. Braves 1 day away. Looking forward to having that back in our lives again. We'll look forward to seeing you all tomorrow there as well. And by the way, check out the ajc.com if you want to for more on this. As I said, Braves getting going here. Also, interesting stuff with the Falcons. Lamar Jackson's requested a trade, but it sounds like the Falcons are not interested, even though at one point in time they were sort of linked to Jackson here a little bit. Arthur Blank had some stuff on that, so you can read that online, ajc.com. And I guess Falcons weren't rated highly by players, and it sounds like Blank's not too happy about that either. So you can read about that all online, ajc.com. Also, check out R.S. Andrews online for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They'll show up on time. They'll do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that, including getting your air conditioning unit tuned back up to factory fresh specs. You'll find them online today at rsandrews.com for a lot more on that. We'll see you back here tomorrow, 9:45 for our 1st and 15 on DawgNation.com, the DawgNation app, 10 a.m. after that for DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We will look forward to talking to you then.